purser. In terms of educational advocacy, this is one of my favorite topics. I think it must be for how often I talk about it and how much I talk about it. There's a lot we can say, but also this topic is so important because educational advocacy and education has the power to transform our children's lives for the better. We know that education can transform a life anyway, but also for our kids who live through so much upheaval and experience so much chaos, if they can really get the right fit in terms of school placement with staff that are championing them on, then that child can really potentially achieve stability in their life, even when the rest of the world is sort of chaos around them. And also we know from the study of adverse childhood experiences and childhood adversity, one stable, caring adult can get the child through, even if that person is in the school setting. So again, educational advocacy has the power to be huge for our children. And as advocates, it's really important to know both what our children are entitled to, what their rights are in the educational sphere, but also what the pitfalls are, what we need to be watching out for. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. But also, I will be very sad by the end because, you know, there will be an infinite amount of ground that we could cover. We won't get it all covered by the end of tonight, but also part of the goal of tonight is to make you hungry so that you'll come back to the other 3 trainings that we have in this series, and actually we'll be adding additional ones, so stay tuned for that. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, and then just to double check, what you guys are seeing right now is just the full screen PowerPoint. Is that right? You're not seeing like the note screen. Okay, great. Okay, so we know that our kids are vulnerable because also for those of you who may be coming from outside the CASA world, CASA, and you know the title of this training, Educational Advocacy for CASA Kids. What I mean when I talk about CASA kids, so CASA is appointed by the court to follow children within the J&D court system who have experienced abuse or neglect. There is no child that comes to us that is not abused or neglected, or at least classified that way. If they were not an abused or neglected child, CASA would not be serving them. So every single child that we serve, we know has experienced abuse or neglect. So we know that every child of ours has experienced trauma. Even if they hadn't experienced trauma in the original abuse or neglect, then if a child has come into foster care, then they certainly have experienced trauma through that family separation and just the you know, the unpredictability of that for the child, the lack of control over their environment. So also we know that children in foster care, children of poverty are overrepresented in foster care, and also children of color are overrepresented in foster care. And when we say children of color, we really mean there are multiple. So Black children, Hispanic children, and Native children are all overrepresented. So this really has a lot of implications when we look at it in the educational setting as well. So if we just think very literally, oh wait, that was supposed to be one of the places where I sort of cue audience participation. So if we think about just on a physical or biological level, go ahead and put in the chat box at least 1 or 2 things. What are some things that our children, our CASA children, have experienced physically, biologically? Okay, and I'll read aloud some of these for the recording. So hunger, moving to a different school, substance exposure, food insecurity, separation, physical abuse, depression, drug addiction at birth, sexual abuse, trauma, emotional instability, missing people they love, housing instability, higher levels of cortisol, tiredness, witness of abuse to a parent. So yes, there is a ton, and we could keep going and going, right? So even just looking at physically and biologically what's happened to our children. So like many of you noted, possible abuse or neglect, possible substance exposure. It could have happened in utero. It could have happened since birth. And also it should be noted that sometimes we know that our kids have experienced substance exposure, but a lot of times we may not know. We may wonder or have suspicions based on, characteristics or behaviors of the child, but we don't always have that information, even if we have access to the parent. And then also, but keep in mind, in addition to in utero substance exposure, there is a lot of neurological development that goes on within the womb prenatally before the child is born. So think about if the mother has experienced high levels of stress or trauma during pregnancy, that can also have a profound impact on the child. The baby's brain organizes around the mother's heartbeat in utero. So again, just think of a mother that's experiencing chronic or spiking levels of stress, what that's doing to the hormones that are crossing the barrier into the womb, and also what that is doing to her own heart rate. So also developmental trauma. So really when I talk about developmental trauma as potentially a distinct thing from abuse and neglect. So abuse or neglect is the experience, developmental trauma is the impact. So when we think about abuse or neglect, every child can really experience that perhaps differently. Even, two siblings in the same household can experience the same event or the same patterns, but react differently to it. So when we think about developmental trauma, that's really when the body's resources have to be so devoted to survival in the moment, surviving that experience, that the body does not have the resources to be curious or explore the environment. So it really shuts down, making those new pathways and connections. And sometimes even there might be damage to the brain or regression. And poverty, of course, as many of you noted. And when we think about the physical experience of poverty, so that can include food scarcity, it can include stressed caregivers. It can also mean less time with your primary caregivers. If mom and dad both have to work full time, you might, have to be with another caregiver during that time. So what about experientially? Go ahead and put into the chat box again, when we think about patterns or experiences that our children have had, what might be some of the patterns or experiences they have had? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. So people have said lack of continuity in education, adjustments to new families, changing living situation, divorce, house hopping, yep, eviction, which in itself is traumatic, lack of structure for sure, lack of consistent schooling, overeating and hiding food, uncertainty of their living situation, separation from siblings, failure by adults to fulfill responsibilities. Yep, that's a good one. So you guys have noted a lot of these, but also, right, abuse and neglect, we talked about that, poverty, Transience. So this can really be a side effect of poverty, is constantly changing or having to shuffle households if there's eviction. Or also, I want to point out that along with poverty, keep in mind that our children can experience more negative environmental factors. So their neighborhoods may be more polluted, or may be unsafer, or they may be exposed to lead or asbestos. I have multiple children on my caseload right now that had lead exposure. We, kind of forget about that one because it's less common these days, but still very possible. Also, there might have been they might have experienced a lot of truancy or high absenteeism. I don't always love the word truancy when we're talking about children who've experienced abuse or neglect, because if they're, unless we're potentially talking about a teenager, especially young kids, they're not in control of whether they get to school or not. So a lot of times, if there has been a high amount of absenteeism, then, that's on the parent. Also, there may have been poor follow through or disruption of services. So think about a lot of the kids and families we serve are Medicaid served in terms of insurance. There may be things that they have to do to keep that Medicaid going. If there's poor follow through, then those Medicaid services can be disrupted. That can impact the child medically, but also if they have what's called day treatment services at school, the sort of at school counseling, if that Medicaid gets disrupted, then day treatment, that school resource also gets disrupted. Also, I've certainly seen it where perhaps the child has, or the school has attempted to initiate services for the child, and maybe the parent, they could never get return contact from the parent or a signature to begin the evaluation or to implement the service. Also, it's really important to note that as sort of a cumulative effect of some of these things we've talked about, our kids can have weakened or continuing to weaken links to their school community because of transience and having to maybe change schools multiple times, or because of absenteeism, or also because of behaviors due to that abuse and neglect, they're getting consistently suspended or expelled. So the more their relationship to and bond with their school environment weekends, then that's bad news for our kids, because we know that kids of trauma need lots and lots of relationship and connection to feel safe and to really be for their brains to be sort of tucked in and ready to learn, if that makes sense. Okay. And I also want to remind that even when we talk about quote unquote just neglect has a profound impact on the brain too. It's not just physical abuse. So this is the brain of a normal 3-year-old on the left-hand side versus the brain of a 3-year-old child who's been extremely neglected. So even, for example, there have been studies done that show that children who grew up in poverty have significantly less language, a less fund of language than children especially compared to higher class, like middle or upper class, just because of the less amount of being spoken to by adults, narrated, things like that. So think about when the caregiver on the neglect side, think about if a caregiver has depression or is using substances or simply is not attentive to or available to the child, then the child is not really, they don't have an active adult who is helping them make connections or narrate the world to them. And also, a lot of times we may see things like where the child is left in the crib or locked in their bedroom. If they have a very limited environment, then they are not exploring and creating those neural pathways. So there are very real biological impacts of neglect as well. Oh, and this is a big thing for us to remember. So when we're looking at this brain scan, we really need to remember, as we think about trauma and the ways that our kids bring their trauma to the classroom, our kids developmental ages may not match their chronological ages. Just because their birth certificate says they were born whatever year, that does not mean that child is developmentally 12 years old. So that's really important for us to know. So a lot of times we may get a teenager that is seeking out hugs and physical affection from adults as if they were an 8-year-old. It's really common for us to see that mismatch. So it's important for us to bring that lens when we see behaviors that seem like they're weird or, you know, that doesn't seem age appropriate. Yeah, that's pretty normal for that to be off for our kids. And remember, development is chronological, so they really can't achieve 12-year-old development until they've progressed through and had 8-year-old experiences, 9-year-old experiences, built the 10-year-old neural pathways, etc. I just want to give a shout out to Sharon Walker. I really appreciate your nods. It's really helping me know that I'm getting through. So feel free, guys, to show emotion. Okay. So, impact of trauma. This is, well, okay. We already saw some of them, but also some of you guys have really been immersed in this trauma world already. Put in the chat box for me if you saw it on the next screen. That's okay. You can totally use that and put it in, or just from your own knowledge. What are some impacts of trauma that you are aware of, whether you've seen it in some of your CASA kids or just from your study of trauma, your hypothesis? What might be some impacts of trauma on our children? Mm-hmm. 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 Yep, start reading some of these. Lack of resilience, anger, acting out, problems with bedwetting, very true. Inability to communicate emotions, for sure. Difficulty sleeping, yep. Inability to react appropriately to changes or environment, yeah, having really outsized, disproportionate responses. Lack of trust, absolutely. Withdrawal, differences in learning, lack of trust, inability to cope. Poor language development, yes, that's a very concrete one that we forget about a lot of times, but it's true. Physical aggression, inability to connect emotionally, attention difficulties, yes, that is another very real one that we sometimes forget about. School dropout, defiance, yep. Anxiety, lack of trust, delayed physical growth. Yes, yeah, good point. There may even be traumatic brain injury that also has its own sort of impacts or personality changes. Distancing, lack of motor skills. Yes, Abby, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's one that we forget about a lot too. We're going to talk about some sensory stuff. Okay, so here is now some of this list. A lot of the left-hand stuff I constructed from, like, you know, a very official article that I read on trauma. A lot of the right-hand stuff is stuff that I see over and over and over again with our CASA kids. You can kind of look at the list and determine if that feels right to you based on the kids you've seen and worked with. I'll give you a second to finish reading the list and then we'll talk through them. Okay, so somebody had mentioned in the chat language and communication skills. This is such a key one. We talked about the impact even just of children who have experienced poverty, the impact on their language skills. How much more children who have experienced neglect, again, they're fond of language. It's not really, I mean, certainly our kids can have, you know, a speech impediment or, you know, mixing up sounds or difficulty pronouncing sounds, but that's not really what I'm talking about. It's the fond of language. the words that they have to describe the world. If they have only experienced very, very, very narrow slices of the world, they're not going to have a lot of vocabulary. And certainly we see this a lot in their ability to express emotions. And also, if you think about sort of living in crisis mode, language, you know, you're not really thinking in poetry, or it's not really to express emotions and things like that. It's much more basic and pragmatic. Also, you know, our kids struggle with cause and effect, and it makes total sense, because the way that I always think of trauma and the way that we or kids experience trauma, think about whatever the cartoon brand was. Think about the Roadrunner and the anvil dropping out of the sky on his head. So if you're the Roadrunner and you're thinking, okay, that was a horrible experience, how do I prevent that from happening again? I don't ever want to have that experience again. Like, what plans would you make around that? How would you navigate to try and prevent that? There might not really be a way that you could prevent it, but also as you're trying to make meaning and understand your environment and what triggered that, you might sort of make up stories for yourself or say, okay, on the day that happened, it started to thunder right before that happened. So maybe it's linked to thunder somehow. You know, you might try and make up you're going to try and create meaning. So that a lot of times is what our kids try and do, but you can also understand for kids who have experienced very chaotic environments or abuse that may be completely disconnected from their own behavior, it sort of snaps that ability to link cause and effect, because cause and effect have not been linked in their environment. Or again, they may, you know, our kids a lot of times have triggers of, okay, this was happening in the environment when that bad thing last happened. So they may have a disproportionate reaction to a trigger, but we don't always know yet what those triggers are. We sometimes have to do detective work to try and figure out what might be setting the kid off. When we talk about executive functioning, so executive functioning is the same type of thing that is inhibited or is less strong of a muscle in ADHD. Think about the ability to plan long term. I was always terrible in school at, like, you know, gigantic projects. So being able to plan from beginning to end, knowing your steps to start, your cognitive flexibility, executive functioning covers so many different things. Working memory is another one. So you see that also in the list, the ability to store and retrieve memory, kind of important when you're trying to pass a grade, being able to remember what was taught in class the day before and, you know, perform it again the next day. All right. And then also perspective taking and empathy. When the child doesn't even really have an established or defined sense of self, then how can they take the perspective of another? Attentiveness to classroom tasks, for sure, ability to self-regulate, but also think about mistrust of authority. Again, that's a natural one. Our kids a lot of times have experienced harm from people who are supposed to be safe, from authority individuals. So especially when the person is new, our kids can be really distrustful of those in authority. They may have a deep sense of unsafety when they're not the one in control. And they may not be able to articulate that or know that consciously, but these might be kids who it seems like are constantly trying to run the show or take care of others, or they fly off the handle when they encounter maybe a more authoritarian authority figure. But again, you can imagine kind of the setup for failure if there is a mistrust of authority or wanting to be in control in the school environment. And then appropriately reading social cues. This is another huge one. So our kids tend, because it is a protective factor, a gift that their brain has given them, they may interpret expressions or social interactions in the most negative light. So for example, you're lining up for lunch, you get lightly jostled by the kid next to you, your brain and your body may prepare, oh my gosh, they're trying to take me down, they're trying to take me out, respond to the threat level midnight. And so again, our kids can have really disproportionate reactions when we're like, hey, chill out, kid, that wasn't even anything, or I wasn't even mad at you, why do you think? But again, they're programmed to expect the worst of people and of their environment. Also, this is so important. Our kids have an internal shame track on constant loop in their heads, especially our kids who've experienced abuse and neglect. But to have that shame track, our kids don't have to have experienced abuse or neglect. Any kind of trauma where you are profoundly out of control of your environment, out of control of your body, and out of control of how your body then continues to respond and process that trauma, your sense of efficacy is going to decrease. So where this shows up, this will sound very familiar to teachers. These are the kids who they completely melt down when you ask them to try a new skill, even if they were able to do it yesterday or you just taught it in the class. If they think they can't do it, they are going to completely flail out. They're going to melt down. They're not going to try. And you might, it's easy to attribute that to laziness or, this is a drama queen kid, whatever. But the fact is, they already are so convinced that they are a failure. And also, it's already been really difficult to get love and affection from authority figures. If I suck more than I already do, it's probably going to be that much harder to get love. People are probably going to want to be in relationship with me even less. So you can see how that could present to them a threat to life, right? Because also, especially for young kids, when they're dependent on others for getting their needs met, lack of affection is experienced as a threat to life for them. Does that kind of make sense? All right, and then also balance and sensory issues. This is also one of my favorite things to talk about in terms of impacts of trauma, because this is what we forget a lot of times. So we've all seen those kids, right? A lot of them are our CASA kids, the kids that don't seem to have a sense of danger, or like jumping off the top step of the stairs, climbing up to the highest branch of the tree, etc. So, we tend to think of those kids as daredevils, but it is actually possible that some of those kids, they may not be getting enough sensory input from their environment to know where their body is in space. So they may be seeking out more sensory experiences. So apart from the senses that we already know, there are things that also the proprioceptive sense that relates to your balance, and it relates to inner ear. Again, those kind of daredevil kids that don't seem to have sense of danger, they may not have experienced enough cradling or rocking or movement from attentive caregivers in their infancy, because that helps the proprioceptive sense develop. And also that comes online, I think, in the last month of pregnancy. So children who are born breech, a lot of times that proprioceptive sense is a little bit off, or, if they were born preterm, if they were a preemie. So yes, there are a lot of things. I need to remind myself of the name of the podcast, but there's a podcast that you should look up. Dr. Barbara Sorrells is her name. She also wrote an amazing book that I highly recommend called Reaching and Teaching Children of Trauma. But she also has a podcast where she talks about attachment in children, impacts of trauma, and she has a particular episode where she talks about the impacts on sensory issues of trauma, and it is utterly fascinating. So I strongly encourage that. Okay, so we've talked about the experiences that our children can have, but let's also talk about, I mentioned this before, so demographically, children are CASA kids. Again, we know that children in foster care, children of color are overrepresented and children of poverty are overrepresented. But also it's worth noting that our kids might have disabilities. Now, this could be an impact of abuse and neglect that they've experienced. It may not be, it may be apart from that, but it is worth noting in the 2018 JLARC report about foster care in Virginia, it noted that children in Virginia's foster care system with at least one diagnosed disability, that number has doubled over the last decade. So again, we know that children coming into foster care often do already have a diagnosed disability. And we might say, okay, so we have that information. What does that matter? What do we do with that? Well, it matters a lot, both in terms of, sure, what educational services they may need at school. Oh, yes, Allison, yes, if you'll share that, Nurturing the Heart of the Child is the name of the podcast with Dr. Barbara Sorrell. And I think there are like 2 seasons and it's fabulous. Okay, but so children who have disabilities, let's take a look. This is from Legal Aid in Charlottesville. It's the Just Children group. For 3 different years, they published data about suspension rates in Virginia. So we have some disparities in our suspension rate in Virginia, and these are pretty consistent with nationwide disparities. But take a second, and sorry, I don't have it labeled. On the left-hand figure, this is the racial disparities. The blue bars are Black children specifically who were suspended, and then the olive tannish bars, those were white children who were suspended. Now, it is worth noting, I didn't represent other races, Hispanic, Native. We do have those populations, but certainly much less. But it is worth noting, like Hispanic children, basically all children of color, are suspended at higher rates than white children. So take a second to look at the left, and then on the right, that figure is depicting suspension rates between disabled children and non-disabled children. And the figure on the right, the red bars are children with a disability, and the brownish bars are children without a disability. So again, just to kind of summarize, the children who are more likely to be suspended are Black children, and then also children with disabilities. Also, I want you to think about the phrase layered vulnerabilities. Our kids are vulnerable, but then they have a vulnerability on top of that, and another one crisscrossing on top of that, and then another one laid over that. So if we think about layered vulnerabilities, even just of the 2 groups on this slide, put in the chat box, what group do you think is the most vulnerable to suspension? If you think about layering vulnerabilities on top of each other just from these 2 figures, what group is most likely to be suspended in Virginia schools? Yep, for sure, Black students. Yes, exactly. Children of color, specifically Black children with disabilities, specifically Black boys. In fact, I'm finding my little statistic. nearly 25% of African American males with a disability were suspended at least once. 1 in 4 of our African American boys with disabilities were suspended at least once in Virginia schools. And that group, Black boys with disabilities, were 20 times more likely to be suspended than white female students without disabilities. That is a significant disparity. And again, not necessarily saying it happens on purpose, but again, as an advocate for a child, you need to know the potential pitfalls. And I also want to point out about that figure on the right, these are just children that have already been identified by the schools as having a disability. A lot of our kids, again, we know based on the foster care stats, a lot of our children in foster care have disabilities, but they may not yet have achieved that, that designation by the schools. That can be a long process. All right, and I also want to point out, this isn't shown on the figures, but I also want to point out, Virginia has suspended a very large number of children that are young, like age 3rd grade and below. In 2016, Virginia suspended 17,320, or they issued 17,320 short-term suspensions to children pre-K to 3rd grade. So when I feel like I see some people making faces like, what? I really appreciate that response. That is the right response. Again, when we think about sort of, you know, there may be the tendency to quote unquote pathologize behavior in younger grades that really is just maybe developmentally delayed behavior, like biting or tantrums or things like that, right? We don't want to be suspending kids based on that. But again, we keep that in mind because our kids may even be benchmarking developmentally behind their peers, well behind their peers. So our kids could be the ones tantruming in 3rd grade or 4th grade or 5th grade, right? Okay, so let's also, from that same year, 2016, take a look at, on the left-hand side is, I sort of cultivated and picked my favorites from the list of impacts of trauma. On the right-hand side is a list of the most common categories of why students were suspended. So take a look through those. Do you feel like you see any potential for overlap between those two lists? So, first of all, attendance. Well, first of all, it's a really dumb idea to suspend students and tell them to go away because they haven't been at school enough. That's a bad idea. But also, if we know that our kids have a history of absenteeism or truancy, they're going to be vulnerable to that. But also, if our kids are distrustful of authority, if they have a deep sense of unsafety when they're not the one in control, if they have difficulty with language to be able to explain a situation or respond appropriately in a social situation or advocate for themselves, then yeah, our kids are going to be the ones perceived as defiant, insubordinate, perhaps the disrespect and walking away. Using obscene language, yep, those are our kids, all right. Even the 1st graders, even the kindergartners. Our CASA kids, you know, not all of them, but many know how to drop an F-bomb or two. But also, I want to point out that that list on the right, it's highly subjective, right? A lot of those things. Disrespect insubordination, those could be highly subjective things. It really is in the eye of the beholder, which again makes the relationship that our kids have with school staff all the more important. And also, it really matters to the story that the person on the receiving end is telling themselves about the behavior, right? We can find a lot more empathy. Like, I'll give you an example. And this was a great example. The school, like, I teared up so many times reading through the records. There was a child that had a significant, it was horrible domestic violence in the home. And when I was reading through the school record, I noticed that there were many documented instances of maybe the child having a gigantic blow up in the classroom, but the school staff would respond amazingly to him and would take him, and sometimes they would rock him in an actual rocking chair, and he would be responsive to that. And then he would fall asleep, and he would sleep for several hours, and they would allow that. And then I noticed as I continued investigating, those instances of when those days happen lined up exactly with police reports of the night before when a gigantic blow up happened, and or corresponding CPS complaints. So I don't know how much the school knew, but having some of the backstory, or being able to hypothesize why might this be happening, that can go such a long way towards creating empathy, and also with putting in place the appropriate supports. All right, so now that I've depressed you, let's talk about what's possible. What can you do? And when I say you, that means anybody. There are so many ways that people in a variety of roles can make a positive impact for our kids, right? But also sometimes when the CASA volunteer comes to a case, they may think, well, I feel like the foster parent has it well in hand. They're an amazing advocate for the child at school. I'm not sure that I'm really needed. And I know the GAL was getting school records too. So lies. If there's one thing that I've learned from working in the foster care system, but also I worked in healthcare as my first job out of high school, as a hospital secretary. Shout out to Ray Newville there. That's right. I see you and your husband. Yep. Ray is a fabulous nurse at the hospital. But working in both those systems, if there's one thing I've learned, and Ray, correct me if I'm wrong about this, in systems, especially really large impersonal systems, even when everybody in the system is doing their best, doing their job perfectly, it is not a bad thing to have an extra set of eyes that know the person and have them right there at the bedside advocating for the patient or for the child. Would everyone agree with that? Go for it, Ray.
Oh no.
No, you're unmuted. I can hear you now. Go for it.
I just said absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, so it does not hurt. And again, there are so many positive ways that you can make an impact at school. But remember, ingredient and strategy number one is bring your good people skills. We're gonna make sure that we know our child and the pitfalls. We're also gonna know the rights that our child has and what they're entitled to, but we're also gonna bring a really good interpersonal skills. And honestly, I have to say, a foster parent can do more to move educational advocacy forward in a case than almost anyone else, because they have that great relationship with the school. They may have had multiple children there, established relationships. They're doing the back and forth texts and calls with the school staff every day, emails. So, let those positive relationships carry you as forward as you can. All right, now, question. This is another chat box question. So, children always Even if you have great conversations with the school staff, you still want to go physically to the school and review the physical school file, always. Why? What can we learn from the school file? Put it in the chat box. What do you think could be learned from the school file? Mhm. Yep. Oh, yes. Grades in classes, trend data, informal comments put in by teachers, patterns, yes, patterns of behavior, WIDA scores. Okay, I'm sorry guys, I'm the ignorant one in the room. Trish, can you also put in the chat box, what is a WIDA score, by the way? Attendance and grades, absences. Oh, health potentially, yep. Patterns of misunderstanding, behavior with other kids, medical. Oh, that's good, Greg. Attendance compared to what pattern or compared to what parent they're with on different days. So are they getting to school regularly when they're with one caregiver and missing a lot of days when they're with another? Oh, that's good, April. Was there a time when things were going really well and then a drastic change? What caused the change? Yeah. Linda, that's a great point. There's definitely decreased physical access to the schools now, but it's true. Usually schools will be cooperative about sending you records by fax or email or whatever, probably fax. Okay, let's also talk about maybe some things that you might forget that you could find out from the school file. Sometimes if I'm having a really hard time getting in touch with a parent, like I don't have a working phone number or whatever, that can be found in the school file or from school staff. Also, I can find out past or current addresses. Also, I have found out contact information for family members that, you know, maybe the parent has been very close-lipped throughout the case. They will not, you know, I have no family, I'm all alone in the world. But lo and behold, in the school file, oh, here's the name of an aunt who is okay, they're cleared to pick up the child. And that can be an indicator of who's part of the family support network. Yes, who's been involved with the child and with the school. Also, we can find out if the child has ever been retained. Have they ever been held back in past grades? Have they attended previous schools? What have been their patterns of behavior, and what is the pattern of disciplinary action? Just how many times has this child been suspended this year? Has the school ever attempted to do a comprehensive assessment to assess the child for an IEP? Does the child have an IEP or a 504? And also, I want to point out that this is one of, I think, the most critical things that a CASA volunteer can do. And I really think of, well, I'll tell you what volunteer I think of. But when we think about, it is so important that someone knows and holds the full story of the child, because our kids, their lives and their stories get fragmented between so many different files and places and people. So it is so important that the CASA volunteer, you need to know the child's full educational history and be able to tell that story in the court report, and also be able to, you know, if the child moves to the next school, to be able to tell the next school, hey, I reviewed the records that you got from X school where the child was before. There's a lot of pages that are missing. Here's what you need to ask for, this and this and this and this and this, right? Absolutely. Yes. And Cassie Gata is the volunteer that I think of with this, about holding the child's full story. Cassie has done such a tremendous job of this, with one child in particular that has had so many home placement changes and so many corresponding school changes. She really did a great job of investigating through the child's medical records and really bringing to light key things that impact how the child may be functioning in school, what further evaluations might be needed, how this might explain some of the behavior we're seeing. And, you know, with each new person that gets involved, making sure that those new people have those back pieces or know where they need to go looking for more information. Yeah. Okay, next question. Yes, good point, Linda. Sometimes a child does well with one style of teacher and less well with others. A pattern can appear. Yep. Patterns is a good word that we always need to be thinking about and looking for when we're talking to the schools. Okay, now, another chat box question. When we're talking to school personnel, when we're planning our little trip, when, you know, we can go physically to the schools again, or when we're planning our list of phone calls, who do I need to talk to at the school anyway? Let's say if it's well, you pick what age you want the child to be. Who should we talk to at the school? Hmm? Yep. So, guidance counselor, classroom teacher, yes and yes. Yep. Looks like everybody's got those pieces. Ooh, secretary. Paula, you're the first one to put that. Tell us why. And I like that idea. Oh, I don't know if that's Paula Geek or a different Paula. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Yes, it is Paula Geek. Sometimes the secretary would be able to tell you who'd been in and out of the school other than the teacher. I mean, other than the parent or the guardian or whatever, if like the person that's not supposed to see the child had been there for whatever reason.
Yes. Always make friends with the secretaries. And a lot of times that front desk person is the person that is taking attendance and like greeting the child when they get, you know, dropped off an hour, 2 hours late, or et cetera, et cetera. And they can tell you, like, there might be something, one line written in the school file, but they may be able to give you a lot of additional context of that interaction when the child was brought in late or whatever. Yes, Cassie, principal and also day treatment. Cassie, tell us why, and I agree with you, but explain to the group, if you're already talking to the guidance counselor, do I really need to talk to the principal too? Why both?
I just think each person has a different set of information about the child and different sorts of interactions. So I would say I just think the more people you can talk to, the better. I love the secretary part too. I think that's a great idea.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and you're so right. Everybody has different interactions with the child. You know, the principal may have been there for 5 years and now has a deep understanding with the child, or, you know, they go for a lot of hallway walks, so they're tight, but maybe the guidance counselor, you know, has a totally different relationship with the child. But also everyone has a slightly different role, and even like if we look forward to thinking about the IEP team, like you want, and you also want to get this child on as many different radars as you can, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Also, somebody mentioned bus driver, and I love that idea. You may have varying levels of success, and this is the transport, you know, the trip to and from school can be where a lot of our children, all havoc breaks loose. So you want to make sure that you're planning for supports there, and also, you know, the bus driver can be an important source of information if you're concerned about neglect at home, like who's there to greet the child when they get dropped off, etc., that type of thing. But you may have varying levels of success. Some school systems don't give out the bus driver's personal contact information, so you may not be able to connect with them directly, but the school may be able to gather reports or information and, you know, convey that to you. So the bus driver, yeah, great idea. School nurse, absolutely. Because especially if the child has a medical condition, but even if they don't, the nurse has been the one to kind of break open a case many times over when there are concerns over and over about the child, and the nurse is the one to document them. Oh, security officer or school resource officer. That's another great one, because remember, our kids can be triggered a lot of times by police or the sight of police or different things like that. And also, depending if the child is having a meltdown or disciplinary infraction, potentially the school resource officer can be the one that responds. So again, while we can't tell our child's full story to the school resource officer, we still want to be looping them in on creating that empathy for the child and hopefully encouraging them to build that positive relationship with the child. Okay, so basically the answer is, for an elementary child, oh, and somebody else mentioned the school social worker or parent liaison. That's a brilliant idea, especially if the child is still in the home or placed with family. If the child or the family has needs, they can help connect the child or the family to resources. Also, in my experience in our areas, if there are concerns and the school is, basically the school social worker a lot of times is the most likely to make a home visit if that's needed or if the school does that. So yeah, those are good things to know. Okay. So what do we do with that information then? Like different people have said, we want to spot the patterns. We want to zoom out and see the big picture. So, yep, we want to understand the patterns. And remember, as CASA advocates or DSS or foster parent, we are likely to have more pieces of information to build that big picture than almost anyone else. So the school may see, for example, okay, the child consistently struggles on Tuesdays. I don't know why, but I know that's a thing. We might know the child has visitation with mom and dad on Monday afternoon, and then they really struggle in school the day after, take a couple days to, regulate, even back out. So again, we have the ability to build that big picture, and we are tasked with helping to communicate that big picture to the judge in our court reports, to the GAL, to other attorneys. We can't always be the one to build that big picture for the school to give them all the information, but again, we can point them to where, hey, you might need more information. I remember a case even where the child successfully, it was a good thing, the child successfully remained at the school where they attended prior to coming into foster care. Well, I guess no one told the school that the child had come into foster care because at some point we found out that the parent was in the school, again, eating lunch regularly with the child, and DSS was, that's not supposed to be happening. There's only supposed to be supervised visitation at DSS that we're directly supervising. So again, or, if the child is in the home or family setting, we can alert the school, hey, you may want to get a copy of the updated custody order or protective order, especially if the parent perhaps is not providing information about, hey, X person should not be around, right? We don't necessarily give them the information, but we cue them, they need to look for the information. Okay. And again, remember, the story behind the child can go such a long way to creating empathy for the child and eventually creating relationship with the child. So again, I think of Cassie, my volunteer Cassie, in terms of this, when we're sitting at the IEP table or, just in a team meeting with the school, we're going to do reframes over and over. And I do this a lot at IEP meetings or child study meetings. The child is not attention seeking. It sounds like, from what you're describing to me, that the child is connection seeking. They are practicing behaviors that will lead them to get interaction with an adult. maybe it's not attention seeking. It sounds like the child is esteem seeking. They're seeking experiences or praise from others that will, allow them to feel good about themselves. So creating that reframe over and over and pivoting to a strengths-based perspective of our child. Okay, so, and right, Linda, you're right. So we aren't allowed to tell the child's full story, but a lot of times sort of it explains a lot just when I say who I am. So I'm a CASA volunteer. So CASAs are appointed in cases of juvenile abuse and neglect when a child is moving through the J&D court system. And my role is blah, 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 right? So they may not need to know all the fine details, but again, if I'm in the picture, then that is a tip off. And again, a lot of times schools are eager to talk to us because schools may have had concerns for years about a child, and they're eager to pass that on to someone. So we know just by showing up over and over and by putting ourselves in this child's world and letting the school or whoever, other systems know, hey, we're going to be here checking in on this child and making sure that they're getting everything they need. That in and of itself is a great thing and can help support your child. But also, the child's classroom teacher is really, I would say, almost your best friend and is one of your best allies. That classroom teacher spends more hours per day with the child than almost anyone else. That classroom teacher is going to know patterns. A lot of times they're going to know, okay, when the child does this, we try to implement that. And that works really well for them. That helps calm them down. When they get upset, they want to take a walk to go see their brother, and that in another classroom, and that really calms them down and makes them feel good. Also, the classroom teacher can sort of, what word do I like, pass you concerns. It can be, I've even heard them express concerns to about the foster parent. Like a foster parent is consistently like, I can never get in touch with them. Work is never signed or reviewed. When I send it home, things like that. The child said X concerning thing. Additionally, the classroom teacher should let you know if the child's needs are being met by their current educational programming. And if you follow up on that concerns, if you kind of carry that ball that they gave you a little bit further, again, you're going to make an ally fast. And let me give you an example of what I mean. So a question that I always specifically ask, whatever services the child is or isn't getting. So do you feel that this is meeting the child's needs? So for example, if the child has an IEP, do you think that the current IEP is meeting the child's needs? Or, whatever the child does or doesn't have. I've had classroom teachers tell me, I really think that they could do with another hour of speech per week. I think that would be really good for them. I've also had classroom teachers tell me, and again, it's always kind of cloak and dagger, but they may say, you need to know that this child's IEP entitles them to 4 hours of pull-out reading instruction per week. The SPED manager has not, been to see this child in several weeks. They are not getting all that they're entitled to in their IEP. So, or also a lot of times the classroom teacher will be the one to tell you, yes, I think this child needs an IEP. But sometimes too, classroom teachers may not be empowered to advocate for that within the system, or, maybe they've tried and gotten their hands smacked, I don't know. But again, we have the ability to, like we always do, clang the bell and communicate a concern forward to the appropriate people. If we're hearing concerns about the foster parent, hey, we may need to communicate that forward to DSS. If we are hearing consistent concerns about how the child is coming to school dressed, then we may need to talk to the school social worker or again to DSS, things like that. If the classroom teacher gives us a concern about how the child's IEP is being executed or if they need an IEP, we may need to then connect with guidance counselor or principal, etc. Okay. So again, I always try to explicitly ask the question, is this meeting the child's needs? And really, there are some ways that we can break that question down. So first of all, whatever academic programming they're getting, is this the right tool for them? Is this the right fit? So for example, if the child does not have an IEP, but maybe has a 504 plan, and we'll talk in a minute about some of the differences between those. Is the 504 really meeting the child's needs, or do they need an IEP, etc.? Also, whatever tool or service they have, is it being implemented correctly? Again, you know, I've definitely seen it where intentionally or completely unintentionally, maybe the child wasn't getting all the services in their IEP. But also, one of the things that you can and should do as an advocate is you need to make sure that every person working with that child is aware of their 504 or IEP. Do school staff even know that that child has an IEP or 504? And if so, are they correctly implementing it? And if not, then you need to follow up to make sure that everyone understands what should be happening, what the child is entitled to. Also, can the tool be tweaked potentially? So for example, if the 504, if we have some accommodations in there around, you know, preferential seating and extended time for tests, but the child is still getting suspended 3 times a month regularly, well, the 504 is really not doing the trick. We need to do something different. You know, maybe we need to beef up the 504 and put in additional accommodations, or maybe we need to do a comprehensive assessment for an IEP. So again, just kind of stay open-minded about what tools you might need, what's already on deck. Keep in mind that definitely there are a lot of ways that a school can meet needs of a child without an IEP or 504. So Title I reading support is a pretty common one that's just, you know, automatically provided. I think that's kind of tiered, like if a child needs additional reading support, and I think that's through federal funds. If there's, you know, an educator, feel free to put more details in the chat box or correct anything I've said about Title I. Also, day treatment, we kind of talked about that. That's for Medicaid kids, that's counseling at school. But I also want to point out, if our kids have an IEP, then, you know, a lot of times we, and by we, I mean advocates for the child or the school, we're really accustomed to try and let day treatment do the heavy lifting to really handle the kids' behaviors and emotional needs or dysregulation. But Medicaid is getting stingier and stingier about who they will approve for day treatment. They also are getting stingier and stingier about approving it for an ongoing period. So for example, so day treatment gets approved, it's approved by Medicaid 3 months at a time. They don't like to do, like if you've had day treatment for a year, well, clearly the service is not working to stabilize the child. You're telling me you need day treatment for another year? That's kind of Medicaid's perspective. Like, clearly it's not working. You might want to try something else. So we really need to look at if the child has behavioral or emotional needs, then we need to put programming in the IEP around those emotional and behavioral needs. And a lot of times we'll get pushback from schools about that. But absolutely, that is a related service that legitimately belongs in the IEP, especially when emotional or behavioral factors are consistently advocating or consistently impacting our child's ability to access education. If the child is spending more time in the office or like in school suspension or out of school suspension than they're spending in the classroom, hello. All right, so ooh, somebody please put in the chat where Trish can learn more about Title I reading support. If you have good resources, definitely at least ask the school, probably guidance about it would be a good place to start. Oh, and Kim, thank you for mentioning TDT is how we abbreviate day treatment, therapeutic day treatment. It's not an evidence-based practice for autism and other non-mental health disabilities. And remember, non-Medicaid children do not have access to day treatment. It's only for kids. It's only a Medicaid-funded service. I completely forget that because I don't serve any kids that don't have Medicaid. I think I've had one in my 7 years with CASA. Okay, so you're saying to yourself, you're talking a lot about 504s and IEPs. What is that nonsense anyway? So basically, 504 and IEPs both function as legal contracts. They codify what the school will provide to the child. 504s and IEPs both are contracts, legal promises of what the school's responsibilities to the child are. And they're individualized and obtained based on the child's needs or disabilities. Okay, so there is federal legislation and then also reiterated in state code and Virginia Department of Education regulations. Schools have an affirmative duty to seek out and be actively looking for children who may have disabilities. So as it stands right now, and again, apologies to any educators or those affiliated with school systems. I hope I don't sound pejorative, but as it stands right now, it's kind of us tugging on the school's, skirt hem saying, hey, I think this child may be disabled. Can we check that out, please? Hey, did you hear me though? I think the child's disabled. Can we look into that? And then, tugging some more. And we may or, kind of go from there. But really the way it's supposed to be is the school is supposed to be in this posture. Are there any children with disabilities out there? And be actively looking for them. And again, the reason why is because, and really when we talk about the definition of a disability for educational purposes, it's if it has significant impact on the child's educational life and their ability to access education. So when we talk about IEPs versus 504s, and sorry if the writing is a little bit small, and definitely guys, this is not an exhaustive explanation of IEPs versus 504s, but it really, again, is more at a glance to just get you started. So let's start with 504s on the right, because they're a little bit easier and less complicated. So basically, when you think of 504 plans, think of accommodations. The role of 504 plans is to remove barriers to general ed curriculum. 504 plans come from Section 504 of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And really, Section 504 is about removing barriers to participation in general public life in all areas of life. So Section 504 is why we have wheelchair ramps and elevators in public buildings. It's why maybe sign language interpreters may be required to appear in court with an individual that's hearing impaired, right? So 504s are really if a child needs help reducing barriers to be able to participate in the classroom. And then to be eligible for 504, it's not enough to have a disability, but it has to affect a major life function and really impact their ability to access general education. So for example, I have a diagnosis of asthma, and sometimes it would flare up at school. I would go visit the school nurse, but I didn't need special, like I didn't need to sit out of PE or have a rescue plan in place or different things. It didn't really impact my life so much at school. But for example, think of a child maybe with cerebral palsy or bladder issues where they need to be catheterized regularly by the school nurse. So that is something that would very much impact their ability to access the general ed curriculum. Or they may need to have someone assist them, like a child that is a quadriplegic. They may need assistance doing schoolwork. So things like that. Yes, Kim is right. The documentation Crip Camp is a wonderful documentary, and it is available on YouTube for free to understand the history of the 504. Really thinking about public access for people with disabilities. The legislation, the 504 plan, Americans with Disabilities, I think that was passed in the first George Bush's presidency. So it's very recent. It's crazy to think about. Okay, 504 plans, you can take them with you to college. I've heard rumors that, potentially a lot of like higher income parents are really pursuing 504 plans and pursuing like ADHD diagnosis for their children. So maybe on the LSAT or different tests, they can have extended time or different accommodations. So again, the 504 can follow you to college. So that's a cool thing about it. But one of the key disciplinary protections for 504 plans is a child with an identified disability for which they have a 504, they can't get more than 10 days of suspension without having to do a pause and saying, wait a second, is this behavior that we're suspending for, is that caused by the disability? So that's a built-in protection. That can be more than 10 days in one chunk, or it can be like separate suspensions that add up to 10 days or more. So that's a really great behavioral protection that is in the 504. Okay, on the left-hand side, IEPs. So it stands for Individualized Education Plan, and you really want to think of the IEP as specialized instruction and or services. So this is a child that may need to have instruction sort of recrafted in order for them to follow along or to access instruction. Who's eligible? I'll show you in a second the eligibility categories in Virginia. And again, the disability has to substantially impact them educationally. To get an IEP, the school has to complete a comprehensive assessment. Usually this involves psychological testing, academic testing, hearing and vision screening, often, and then you can choose add-ons like speech screening, potentially a physical therapy, occupational therapy evaluations. IEPs, you can get IEP services all the way up till graduation, even if the child is incarcerated or even if the youth is over 18, maybe like a person with an intellectual or developmental delay. They may, they can go to school until I think age 21, basically until they complete graduation. And again, they get the same disciplinary protections in an IEP. And thank you to the person who corrected me that 504 was passed in 1973. Clearly, I need to watch the documentary Crip Camp one more time just to refresh. Okay, so, and just a heads up, what I see a lot of times, and I'll be curious, feel free to respond in the chat box if you've had a different experience, but what I tend to consistently see is kids a lot of times will have 504 plans. My experience, again, just speaking on what I've seen, it seems to be, it's a lot, definitely, the process to get them is easier. You don't have to do the comprehensive assessment piece. A lot of times, when I get assigned on a case, a child may already have a 504. A lot of times I feel like the 504s might be puny. And again, not really addressing the child's need. But what I tend to experience is that IEPs, you have to fight tooth and nail a lot of times to get those. Not even to get the IEP, but to get the school to agree to do the comprehensive assessment for an IEP. And, you know, just something to know, both IEPs, and again, anyone who knows more about it, feel free to add more info or correct me in the chat, but 504s and IEPs, when a child has one, it does bring some federal dollars with it, but there is also local cost to the school, especially to implement IEPs. And you know, I don't know, but a working theory may be that may be some of the barriers to securing assessment and or services in the IEP, because both definitely do cost. Okay, so these are some of the eligibility criteria in Virginia. I'm curious, what you can put in the chat, what are some of the categories that you have seen most used for children in your cases? Yep. Yes, Robbie said autism. That is one that is for sure growing, both at the national, the state level, on my caseload. ADHD is another one we see a lot. That usually comes in under the last category, the OHI, other health impairment. Yep. And then emotional disability is another really big one. I will point out, go for the low-hanging fruit. Developmental delay, age 2 to 6. In my experience, I find it a lot easier for very young kiddos to get IEPs, partly because in general, we have early intervention, also known as infant-toddler connection. They will seek to screen children ages 0 to 3 for developmental delays. And if the child needs services, they'll provide it free of charge. Medicaid covers. But also when the child ages out at age 3, they help connect the child to get an IEP from the school system, even when the child, you know, may not even be attending school yet, but they can get special education services like speech or developmental teacher, things like that. They can get those services delivered in their childcare setting or in a pre-K setting by the school free of charge. And then again, those kids that already come into their school experience with that developmental delay, they can keep rolling with that IEP until age 6. Yep. Okay. Any specific questions so far, or Allison, have you? I think I've been answering most of the questions as we've gone along. Okay, so here are some of the common objections that I hear when talking to schools and we're trying to convince them it would be a good idea to comprehensively test a child. And also, for what it's worth, you know, when you think about it, the kids that we serve that often have had multiple school placements, and keep in mind with every school change, supposedly you may lose up to 6 months of academic progress, and also, you know, semesters, subjects may be different school to school. Grades may or may not be the best measurement of the child's abilities. Oh my goodness, so many times, you know, homework and kids refusing to complete homework, or like hiding their homework under their bed or throwing it out the window of the school bus. You know, this may be one of the few areas where the child has control over their life. And also, as they go through legal court process, they may have significant fluctuations in their ability to focus or you know, to emotionally process. So grades may not be the best indicator of their abilities. So really, I would say, hey, it's a great idea to do an assessment, a full assessment of this child, so we can really look at some objective data, because grades tend to be a bit more subjective, right? If a teacher really likes you, she may bump you up that last point to the next grade letter, etc. So let's get some baseline data and really look at the child's abilities. But that's that can be a hard sell. So here's some common objections that we hear. We don't know them well enough or have enough data yet. That's a really valid point. This is where the CASA advocate, or you, the advocate, whether you're the foster parent or what exactly, this is where you come in. This is why it's key for us to examine that school file, to understand the child's full educational history and story, and also to make sure, so many people mention the word patterns. When we're combing through those school records, we want to fully understand the patterns. You might not have enough data, but don't you worry. We're going to make sure you get the data you need. And sometimes our role as CASA can, again, be cueing the schools about how they can look for that data and pursue finding it under their own credentials. So, for example, sometimes if a child has changed schools, sometimes I will say to the new teacher, hey, do you want to talk to his previous classroom teacher? I can check with her and see if she's okay with exchanging, cell phone numbers with you or email addresses. Or I will request the previous teacher write a letter more fully documenting the child's behavior and patterns. Or I can say, hey, by the way, there are 3 more schools that you need to request records from, things like that. And also, legally speaking, and again, in later sessions, we'll get into these more, delaying testing in order to try a strategy to see if it works or to accumulate more data, that is not really a legally recognized strategy. Schools aren't supposed to do that. You can try a strategy, but we can start some testing while we try the strategy. That can be all part of our data gathering. Also, sometimes what schools will say, they're already getting everything they would in an IEP anyway, or there's nothing else we could offer them. Maybe that might be true. But also remember, if someone is delivering a service or an accommodation just out of the goodwill of their heart, that staff person may not be there next year. Also, the child can transfer to a different school tomorrow because their foster placement disrupts. We cannot go based on goodwill. This child needs a legally binding contract that will follow them place to place. So yeah, that's really important to know. And that's kind of the pushback for that. Also, one of my favorites, we don't want them to have a label or to be stigmatized. So, it is certainly true that, and especially this seems to come up a lot with the emotional disability eligibility category, we don't want them to be stigmatized. And certainly it is true that, kids can bully one another. But what I would say to that, if you're worried about that, then what that tells me is you have a school culture problem. You may have educators that are in need of further education, so that, we are destigmatizing mental health diagnoses or emotional disability. It doesn't automatically equate to that child being scary. Also, if your special ed kids are getting stigmatized, then maybe that means we're not doing enough inclusion work where they're having enough contact and integration in with the general population. That sounds like a prison. Sorry, guys. But it is also worth pointing out, there was a JLARC report that just got published in December of this past year, that talked about that children with disabilities are less likely to graduate. And again, guess what? Guess what the most vulnerable category was? Black children with disabilities were even the most highly impacted of less likely to graduate. And also sometimes schools will pull out, let's ask the child if they want an IEP. Well, no, we're not going to do that. The child, absolutely, we should be getting their input when we are designing an educational program for them, but also the school has legal responsibilities to identify children with disabilities, and you know, just like in foster care cases, we don't make decisions about whether to send kids home to parents on whether or not the kids want to return home. Pretty much all of our kids want to return home, and that's a valid thing, but we are tasked with gathering so much more data and looking at the full picture. And also, the child may not understand the full legal implications of what an IEP or 504 may entitle them to. That's part of what we as advocates are tasked with understanding for them. Okay, so we're almost getting to a point where I'm not going to be the one talking for a minute. Woohoo! So our foster kids are entitled through legal and state policy and legislation to school stability. What that means is that children have the right to remain stable in their school placement. In Virginia DSS and Virginia DOE have worked together to create Fostering Connections to Success. I'll see if I can find the link to that and put it in the chat for you so that you can download that policy and have it. It's like an 11-pager, it's not too much. But I'll go ahead and let Shayna or April, either one, to kind of talk from the social services perspective about, okay, so what exactly are the mechanics of advocating for school stability?
I couldn't figure out how to unmute for a second. Okay. All right. Shayna, you there? Okay. Okay. So, all right, where should we start? Christy, you've done a great job of presenting all kinds of information. I think from a social services foster care perspective, when kids are in foster care and we're talking about potentially moving or educational stability, one of the I think kind of what we've talked about are some of the biggest times where that becomes a risk of a disruption in their school placement are when they first come into care. If there is, for whatever reason, if they're in a foster home and it doesn't look like it's going to work out or they're going to move, those are times when potentially they're at risk of having a school change. Semester breaks, you know, sometimes if a school year ends and the foster parent is out of that district, they sometimes want, a foster family might want to enroll them in the following year in a new school, in their whatever school they're zoned for. And so those are just really important times to kind of jump in and kind of figure out what is best for this child. The whole kind of premise and idea behind best interest determination meetings is that the Virginia Department of Social Services and the Virginia Department of Education really have created this agreement. And what the first kind of given is that children should remain in their school of origin. We should do whatever we can to keep that child in that school. And especially when kids come into foster care, they've already lost so much. They've lost their home, a lot of times neighbors, friends, you know, their belongings. Sometimes they're placed away from siblings and they lose contact with extended family. One of the few things that we can give them and we owe them, we really have an ethical obligation to try to do, is keep their school the same. Christy mentioned earlier, you know, when kids move school placements, sometimes they lose 6 months to 12 months to 18. It varies, but they lose a significant amount of time in school. Just in their education, there's just huge gaps. And we see that, I don't know, Christy, I'm sure all of you could agree that you see those massive holes in just their education. And so one of the really important things is that we have to remember is that the best interest determination, that guidance gives us the ability to say, like, this child should stay in their school of origin. So the moment we know that a child is going to move, one of the first things that should happen is the DSS agency should reach out to that school and say, hey, this is what's going on with this child. We want them to stay in their school. Now, granted, every DSS probably works a little bit differently, but this is in April's ideal world and how we try to function in Lynchburg. And so, you know, one of the first things that should happen is there should be a contact with that school. Hey, this child is moving and we want them to stay in your school. We want you to know that. I will say that for the most part in Lynchburg City, they're going to agree to keep their child. Teachers are very compassionate. They, you know, for the most part, they don't want to lose that child. They're already worried about that child. And so they want to do whatever they can to keep those children in their schools. So we would essentially contact the school and essentially there are a few factors where you don't have to have a bid meeting. And that would be if the child is being placed over 100 miles away. If the child is already zoned, for example, if the foster home or kinship home is in that area already, you wouldn't have to have a bid meeting because they wouldn't be switching schools just based on their zoning. If for whatever reason they're going into a residential facility, obviously there would not be a bid meeting because more than likely they're going to be attending some kind of schooling in that residential facility. And I feel like there's one more that I'm forgetting, and it will come to me in a second. There's one more, but so what that means is a lot of times our kids are going to have a bid meeting, and that means that DSS and that their school of origin would come together. There are a lot of individuals that should be invited to that meeting: birth parents, foster parents. You can invite the GAL, a CASA could be invited. The child should be there, really, truly. Their social worker, case manager, a school representative, and then additionally, sometimes, a lot of times I see in these bid meetings, there will be individuals from that school system too as well. And it might be like a teacher that has a connection with them. It could be if they're receiving special education services, something along those lines. But ideally, we would have that meeting, and the questions are very child focused. And if the child's there, I think it's even more meaningful because they will ask things about, what do you want? What are you good at? What is your strength? Things like that. And so it really kind of brings the child in. I will say more often than not, I feel like when we have those meetings, ultimately the decision is made. Where some of the difficulty comes in sometimes is that assuming there's an agreement that the child will stay in their school of origin, the responsibility to pay for transportation is on the local Department of Social Services. In Lynchburg, we say like we'll do almost whatever it takes to make that happen, which means we will reimburse for mileage. We will, if we can work on a transportation plan, or we can put them in a daycare that will pick up and transport from that school, something along those lines. We try to get as creative as we can. That money is, Shana, you can speak up to it, but I think 40 and CSA will both reimburse those funds. So every agency should be able to do these things. Every social services agency should be able to reimburse for that transportation. One of the things that with our foster parents in Lynchburg that we say up front from the day one is if you're going to foster with Lynchburg, you're going to keep these kids in their school. Every once in a while there's a situation or whatnot, but for the most part, that is the expectation from the beginning. They've lost everything. They shouldn't have to lose their school placement too. One of the only comforts they have left, they shouldn't have to lose that. And so that is an expectation we set with foster parents up front. And sometimes, when you have a family that is saying, okay, I'll take these 4 kids, it is, I have 2 kids myself. I know in the morning getting out the door is sometimes difficult. And I can imagine if you have to add on an extra 20, 30, 40 minutes or whatnot. And so it's really important that we keep kids in this community close so that we can kind of take those pieces out. But yeah, so we really have to get creative. I think, Christy, there was a case one time where the foster family, I think they either linked up with like another foster family or a relative or a friend, and then those people transported the child to school. And so there are ways to get creative and think about this, because at the end of the day, that's what it matters is what's going to be best for this child. Yeah. What am I missing, Christy? Anything in particular? I feel like I'm just trying to get it all out.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. April, would you agree that, because I know exactly which case you're talking about where the foster family did the creative workaround, where before and after school, they dropped off with a foster family that was located in the right school district and the bus could pick them up. And that was an amazing creative solution. But I also remember I kept following up in that case with you, because also if you as a CASA or the advocate have a concern that, hey, I'm concerned that we're getting ready to change school placements and I really think it would be best for my child to stay stable. And I think that's very achievable. It's not like it's like 50 miles away or something in a daily commute. Yeah. You may also want to, in addition to trying to communicate about it with the social worker, if you're not really getting anywhere, loop in the supervisor, because I will say, I think this is true both in terms of DSS, but also on the school side. Your people on the ground may have varying levels of knowledge about the law or policy or regulations, whereas your supervisors are going to be much more on top of that. So, if you don't feel like you're getting what you need from the worker, don't be afraid to loop in the supervisor and go to them. Because again, they know like some of the creative options that we've used in the past and what is possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. As a supervisor, and I know Shana would agree with this, we absolutely want to know. It's really like that's something we've been talking about for years now. It's really an expectation that we do whatever it takes. And so we want to absolutely know. And, none of this is a perfect system. we have new workers, we have people that aren't, maybe haven't worked with older kids, whatnot. And so things happen, things slip. So absolutely, if you don't feel like you're being heard or things are not happening and you're getting concerned, reach out, please. Like, let us fix that before something happens. I just kind of like a quick story, and just kind of that reiterates why it's so important to keep kids in their school. We had a child, he was 14 years old. It's actually the child we were talking about, Christy, but this is just like he came into fault. We got a call one day that we had, I think he was almost 14. This young man coming into care with his little cousin. And I called and called and called home after home. I could not find a placement for these two kids. And I met with him, talked to him, just kind of asked some questions, trying to feel out like, if we had any options with family or friends. And all he said was, I don't care where I go. Please just find her a home. I'll go anywhere. Just find her the best home you can. And I have SOLs in the morning. And like when I called the school, they said, he is an excellent student. He's amazing. Please just do whatever it takes to keep him in this school. And we did. And we made that happen. And but I say that to say is like, those things are so important to kids. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a teenage boy say, well, I have SOLs tomorrow, or I have a test coming up. And those are things they're thinking of. And in one of the worst days of their life, a day where they're removed from their family, they're still thinking about what comes in the morning with school. And that just always amazes me. And it's hard. As much as they have weighing on them to like, that's what they're thinking of, really a test tomorrow. And so that's why it's so important to give them that. I see, I'm kind of like trying to peek at some of the questions, McKinney-Vento Act, you're right. That some of that transportation piece, it just kind of comes back to the financial piece of it is on the local Department of Social Services. And we do have the means to pay for those things. I will say a lot of school systems are really flexible because ultimately people do want what's best for children. And so a lot of times, transportation will work out things for us without us having to pay. And they are flexible. So absolutely always reach out. That's always an option too, to reach out to transportation. Samantha, you asked about what about permanency when kids are getting closer to adoption, but the kids did not do well with the change. I guess, do you mean like school change or just like the transition in general, or I don't know. Okay, well, you can chime in there somewhere if that comes up. Let's see. Yeah, some foster parents don't know they can get reimbursed. That's something we try to like pound into our foster parents. We will reimburse you for this. We will reimburse you for that. But obviously there are 120 localities, I believe, in the state, and so a lot of people probably aren't aware of that. And so that is something that you can take that information and share with them. That's one of the things when we're making calls to place children, we'll say like, they go to this school. Can you maintain that? We will reimburse you. And so those are just things for you to think about too, to talk to the DSS agency. Let's see. Yep. And yeah, Christy, if we anticipate that kids will be returning home to their prior community, we should prioritize school stability. Absolutely. And that gets tricky too, because what if a child, for example, left their birth home and when they were in the 5th grade, and now they're in middle school. So they've changed schools anyway, and they're going back home, and that parent is in zoned for a totally different area. Like, that's complicated. How do we work that piece out? What can we do as a team, like in a family partnership meeting? What can we come up with for a school plan? Because sometimes what I've learned though is with school stability, sometimes that doesn't always, the middle school piece or the transition to high school, sometimes that's not their school of origin anymore. And so that sometimes can get complicated. A lot of times schools will be flexible and whatnot, but those are things to be thinking of ahead of time, especially if it looks like return home is on the table. I hope that makes sense. But some of those tricky things, like when kids transition to middle and high school, sometimes they get a little bit trickier.
And April, can you remind me too, I feel like I encounter this more maybe with our rural localities, or there is the possibility that, say, if a child returns home or gets placed with a family member and they want to remain stable at the school they've been attending that is out of that placement's district, sometimes it is possible for them to attend long-term a school out of the district, but I think it costs a certain amount per semester. It's not like a crazy amount. I think it's like, I don't know, 100-ish, or I don't know what the amount is. But I think it also depends on capacity that the school may have. So that may be something that you can talk about or check out, like in a family partnership meeting, like April was saying. But it may also, like, if that's going to be a continuing expense for the family and that is a financial burden for them, that may not be a possibility.
Yeah, and sometimes we know too, some of our more rural areas, they might not have the transportation that a city would have, such as the buses or whatnot. And so sometimes that becomes a barrier for families too when they're working towards return home. But yeah, I think there are lots of ways to get creative. And that's why it is important to have so many people together and around the table. And that's why it's important anytime we're talking about a move for a child, we really should be having an FPM so that we can really make a plan for these things. Yeah. Anything else? I'm trying to look over here. I'm trying to read them both.
And April, you guys have put a lot of very conscious work and effort around, like you said, educating and communicating your expectations to foster parents that the norm and the expectation is school stability, and that's consistent with law and policy. And I do think that Virginia DSS as a whole has put emphasis on this, like making sure that agencies are paying more attention to this and documenting this. But prior to that, and also without enforcement by the DSS agency or worker, a lot of times it really does come down to preference and convenience of the foster parent. So again, as the advocate, you need to know what your child is entitled to. And again, depending on when the child comes into care, the child may, the foster parent may be willing to continue transporting the child to their school of origin for the last month of school, but then semester breaks, like April said, is like a high risk time when you want to be looking out. And if you do want to sort of push it to someone's attention that, hey, I think we're at risk of disrupting our school placement, I don't think we need to do that, then email the principal of the school, both the school of origin and the potential new school, as well as your social services agencies, to request a best interest determination meeting.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will notice too a lot of times with treatment foster care, those foster homes too, a lot of times I think the expectations a little bit different in terms of schooling and whatnot. Christy, some of the things I saw that you had on your list that we didn't touch on that I do want to just talk about really quickly is birth families should always still be, if parental rights are still intact, they have not been terminated, birth parents, it is the school's responsibility to invite those parents to IEP meetings. Sometimes the DSS worker will have to finagle and figure out contact information or whatnot, but they should still be invited to that 504 IEP meeting. Any of those meetings, that the birth parent should still be invited. The birth parent, so social services cannot sign an IEP. The birth parent is supposed to do that. So I know sometimes we've had to track parents down and try to find them. And if we can't, then sometimes the school will have to get a surrogate parent assigned. Sometimes I think that can be the foster parent, especially if it's heading towards permanency with the foster family. But a lot of times I think, in some situations I've seen the school have to appoint a different surrogate parent to sign for that child that doesn't have any kind of vested interest or conflict of interest, I guess. Yeah, so those are just important things just to remember too, that the birth parent, unless if their parental rights are still intact, they should be coming and participating as well. And they should absolutely be getting invited. It's not something DSS can say, no, they shouldn't be here. They're supposed to be invited.
Absolutely. So yeah, let's talk about that, about partnering with our biological parents. I know we have just a couple minutes left. We're going to try and squeak it out here. Okay, can you guys see the full screen PowerPoint?
Not yet.
Okay, there it is. Can you see it now?
No.
Okay, so I'm going to talk while I try and share. Okay, so sometimes, like April was saying, I believe it's federal legislation that requires schools to reach out and locate birth parents and try and bring them to the table anytime we have a child study or IEP meeting if parental rights have not been terminated. However, I will say that Virginia law allows the foster parent to sign as the parent. So if we don't locate the birth parent or bring them to the table, the foster parent is able to kind of move that ball forward. However, as the CASA advocate, we should be working to bring the parent actively to the table. And you might be thinking, but why would we do that? Isn't like the child before us, isn't that the parents' fault anyway? Aren't they just gonna make everything worse? Well, think about the fact that return home and relative placement are our two most highly prioritized goals. Those are the goals that we should be working towards. So the likelihood that the child will return to being placed with family is high. So we really want the parent to be seeing modeled good advocacy skills, how to positively interact, but firmly advocate around concerns with the school. We also, you guys have probably experienced it in your cases where the parent may think, well, you guys broke the child once they came into foster care. Everything was fine before, right? We've definitely heard that narrative a lot, even sometimes when we have documentation and records that show that is not the case. So, and also, you know, just because of dynamics and kind of the adversarial relationship that can perhaps, you know, develop between the parent and DSS, or, you know, the parent, especially near the beginning of the case, may feel adversarial towards DSS. A lot of times, you know, they may think lies of anything that DSS tells them, including how their child is functioning. So the more parents can hear this information and the more times they can hear it from as many different sources as possible, the better for sort of helping develop their awareness and grasp of the child's functioning and understanding of their current needs, not just when they came into foster care, but since. And also, you know, that is a key reason why we really need to try and advocate for parents to be able to have access to medical appointments while their child is in foster care, educational appointments, because also we can get a lot of history from the parents. You know, in the IEP evaluation process, they always ask about, like, okay, was the child premature? When did they start hitting their developmental milestones? Were they slow to learn to walk? All this kind of stuff that the foster parent, a lot of times, unless it happened in their home, they're like, I don't know. So we really need to bring the parent in for to share narrative and history. And again, we know that sometimes parents aren't always going to be reliable narrators, but usually there is at least one reliable narrator in the mix. A lot of times the foster parent is able to supply a lot of information. Social services is able to as well. So again, we're able to bring all those pieces of information together and again, get closer to a complete story of the child. And also you really want to think about, and guys, I realize we're 8:01, so if you need to leave, then feel free. But you really want to think about helping prepare the parents so that they can participate constructively in the meeting. So I've definitely had IEP meetings or school meetings where parents are at the table and we're really kind of using those de-escalation skills that we get really good at in family partnership meetings. And you know, so that can be an aspect you may want to think about. Is this something that the parent could be really supported by the parent coach? Maybe they could sit down ahead of time and sort of prep for the meeting. And also think about, you know, a lot of our parents may be bringing trauma of their own educational experiences at school. Also, our parents, depending on their own level of functioning, it may be really hard for them to process through and understand the paperwork. And guys, it is exceedingly difficult for any of us to understand all the special ed regulations and paperwork. Sometimes I feel like that's on purpose, but it can be really difficult. It's a complex field, so we should not be surprised that it may be intimidating. And also, if you ever, as an advocate, have come to the IEP table, it is incredibly intimidating, even if you think you have a good argument or good data on your side. So intimidating to have, you know, 7 people from the school and then you're the little lone one over here and maybe you may be advocating a different direction. It's so intimidating. So we need to be doing what we can to amplify the family voice. I sometimes have had to fulfill the role of kind of holding firm with the school. No, we're not actually going to start before the family gets here. We're going to wait. Mom might be running a little bit late, but this child is on track for a trial home placement in a week, and we need to wait for mom. She needs to be here. Also, I want to give a shout out, Hutcherson Early Learning Center. They are wonderful for how they support and shepherd parents through the IEP process. They do a wonderful job of explaining the data, of taking a very strength-centered approach to the child and to the parent. They really do a great job of forming relationships with the parent. And keep in mind, again, you know, if we do our job well as CASAs, as foster parents, as DSS, then eventually we're going to disappear from the picture. And it's going to be the organic support networks that are left for the family. So we really want there to be a strong relationship, strong positive relationship being built between the school and the parent, so that the parent feels comfortable sharing concerns or asking for help from the school if needed, or so that the parent and school are able to communicate to resolve differences or complications. And keep in mind, parents are legally entitled to invite who they want to IEP meetings. So if they want a support person of their own, because again, their parent coach, like if the child is successfully returned home, the parent coach isn't going to follow the case for 18 years, right? So we really want to think about who would that parent want potentially to come with them to either be an extra set of ears or to take notes so that they can participate in the meeting, or someone else who knows the child and could contribute good ideas and information. That's definitely possible. And also, you know, this isn't typical, and again, it really depends on the case, but you may want to think about how you want to communicate with the parent in advance of the IEP meeting, especially if the child is placed in the home. You may want to talk about what the parent's concerns are and what they would really like to see happen, and maybe explain what you're going to be asking for. You know, we can also make sure that they got a copy of the data ahead of the meeting, things like that. Okay, and also, again, if we're looking at potential placement with relatives, then that relative, we need to start bringing them to the table for educational meetings, appointments, make sure that they get a copy of the IEP, etc. And then also, if the parents have a positive experience with the school or wherever, then that makes them more likely to be willing to come to the next table. That might be a family partnership meeting, right? So, okay. Any questions about any of that? Oh, Jean, that makes me happy that you're seconding Hutcherson being awesome. I get so excited if I get to have an IEP meeting at Hutcherson. It's my favorite. Okay. Well, guys, thanks for hanging in there with me. Does anyone else have anything they want to add? Anything I completely forgot? Remember that our next session is going to be about really the building blocks of IEPs and 504s, understanding the policy and law underneath it. It's going to be taught by a special education attorney, Melissa Wall. The next session after that is going to be about what do I do? How do I advocate next if the school says no, if they reject my idea of what I think we need? Where do I go from there? And then the next session after that is going to be specifically trauma-informed special education with a racial justice lens. So I'm so excited about that. That will also be taught by a special ed attorney. And then it's not on the website yet, but we're going to be adding a session about how to get social skills into the IEP, which again is a huge need for our kids. So excited. Foster parents absolutely invited to these sessions. It's open to the general public. Please share as widely as you can. And I'm thinking about, I think it would be amazing to also maybe have a session around, how do we involve the parent and the child when we're advocating, supporting the parent and the child. I think that would be amazing to talk about because we probably don't enough. I'm also going to put some links here. Here is a link to, I referenced the legal aid reports, multiple years on suspension data in Virginia. There's a link if you want to read any of the reports in full, if you're a nerd like I am. All right, but other than that, make sure that you have put your name and email address if you want to be credited and or receive a certificate